Hi, I'm Colin Dueck, visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Today, we've invited a distinguished panel to discuss The Last Shah, the latest book by Ray Takeyh of the Council on Foreign Relations. A senior fellow for Middle East Studies at CFR, he is the author of a number of books and articles on Iran, political reform in the Middle East, and Islamist movements and parties. He was also senior advisor on Iran at the Department of State. Our other panelists include Ambassador Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, who, among other distinguished posts, has served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Ambassador to Finland, Ambassador to Turkey, and Chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission. And finally, Kenneth Pollock, resident scholar here at AEI, especially in the Middle East, who served on the NSC as well as in the CIA, the author of a number of books and articles, including most recently, Armies of Sand. Ray's latest book right here has received rave reviews, The Last Shah, and came out from Yale in January. I've asked him to speak for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we're going to have discussion. Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to the American Enterprise Institute for inviting me. This is really a thrill for me to be on this panel. I think Colin and I met when we were in our early 20s and have spoken about these issues since then. One of the highlights of my career, and there have been very few highlights, is collaboration with Eric Edelman. Eric has certainly ennobled me. I'm not quite sure if I've done anything for Eric. And I think I spent more time during pandemic with Ken Pollock than anybody else. And that has made pandemic a little bit easier for me, and certainly maybe it made it harder for him. So it is a genuine pleasure for me to be here with these three very distinguished people whose perspective I and everybody else values. I'll be brief given the level of expertise on this panel. I tried to do one important thing in the book, and I think it was mentioned in the Wall Street Journal review, is to try to put the Iranian actors front and center, because I think that's the important way of looking at the history of this period from 1941 to 1980, where I think the Iranians were the principal drivers of their own history. And the accomplishments of the Iranian political class for much of that time was rather extraordinary. Most people look at the revolution and the 1953 coup, but in my opinion, the 1940s were an extraordinary time in the history of Iran. It was a country that was occupied by both the Soviet Union, Britain, and later America. There was no guarantee that they would continue with the monarchy and even openly discuss disbanding it. Yet the Iranian political class managed to do two things during the 1940s. It was negotiate the sovereignty of the country, namely get the allies to commit to leaving the country after cessation of the conflicts of the war. And after the Soviet Union was reluctant to do so, collaborate with the United States in eviction of Joseph Stalin from the Iranian territory. It's the only time I can think of that during the Cold War when Joseph Stalin disgorged territory. You cannot discuss Iran in this period without talking about the 1953 coup. And whatever your perspective or mechanics of the coup, to me, when you look at the history of this period from 1941 to 1980, the coup doesn't stand out as an extraordinary consequential event in shaping the subsequent history of Iran. Most people who talk about this issue and write about it draw a very casual and linear line between the 1953 coup and the 1979 revolution, as if the intervening quarter of century didn't happen. It is my perspective in the book that the coup does not fundamentally change the political landscape of Iran or the institutions of Iran, the parliament, the prime ministers. Iran still had a powerful parliament, still had a prime minister, still had a monarch that had to share power with other institutions. And the autocracy that we talk about that descends on Iran, the sort of a rigid dictatorship, doesn't really come about in the aftermath of the 1953 coup, but mostly in the early to mid-1960s when you see, in my opinion, the most consequential changes take place in the Iranian political body. So I began discussion of the coup not so much focus on its mechanics, which I will get to in a second, but on the sheer consequentiality, on the sheer importance, because I don't believe in shaping the remainder of the Pahlavi dynasty and the tragic end of it. The coup was as consequential as people suggest. This is not to minimize its importance. Now, what happened in the coup? There are about 6 people who really care about this, and they will argue about it for the rest of their lives. I want to say that I am not one of those 6. I have often been conscripted into that cohort, but I'm happy to leave it. In August 1953, Iran does not have 1 but 2 coups. The first one, I believe, was August 15 that failed, and the second one on August 19 that succeeded. There is no question that the United States and the Central Intelligence Agency were complicit in the first coup. And you can stop right there and say that particular intervention in the internal affairs of a sovereign country was wrong. And I'm perfectly willing to stipulate that, because that was the position of the CIA station chief, Roger Gorian, the gentleman who passed away in Florida about a decade ago, who the CIA station chief actually opposed the coup. The second coup on August 19 succeeded, in my opinion, primarily because the initiative had passed on mostly to Iranian actors, the military, and so forth. But is often neglected. In the 1950s, in the early 1950s, the monarchy had the support of all of the traditional institutions, the military, the clergy, as well as the merchant class and urban nobles. So that class was capable of acting on its own in many ways. And it did, in my opinion. But this is an argument without an end, and people will argue it and argue it and argue it. But I want to draw attention not so much to the mechanics of the coup and the degree of the American complicity, but essentially to the importance of the coup in shaping the remainder of the Iranian history. The most important part of the Pahlavi dynasty that, in my opinion, made the revolution at least possible were the things that happened in the 1960s and certainly in the early 1970s. You had the rise of a new elite that was westernized in its orientation, and their currency of exchange, unlike the old elite, was not familiarity with the country and its traditions, but mastery of various Western political paradigms, stuff they learned at the Jack Kennedy School and so on. So you're beginning to see a gap between the elite and the masses of the public. You're beginning to see the emasculation of the Iranian institutions. The parliament and prime ministers no longer matter. The Iranian state in the 1960s becomes younger. Prime ministers are in early 40s, and essentially the new elite is comprised of younger men who, as I mentioned, their currency exchange was not familiarity with Iran itself, but familiarity with Western development paradigms that they learned. So the gap between the elite and the public. You see the very significant loss of confidence in civic institutions at the precise time when you had the growing urban middle class that demanded political rights. In the 1970s, in Iran, as well as elsewhere in the Middle East, you also see the rise of a certain religious revival. And that can be estimated by mosque attendance, number of people who are joining the clergy, pilgrimages within Iran and without. There's a real serious attempt to reclaim tradition in midst of modernity and midst of all these alien ideologies that were being embraced by the elites. Why did Iran have a revolution? I think it is often suggested a revolution is a mystery, not a secret. A secret can be read, a mystery has to be unraveled. And I'm not even sure it can be unraveled. Revolution is a phenomenon that's impossible to predict ahead of time. I think it's difficult to understand it when you're living through it. And as I have learned, it's very difficult to retrospectively chronicle it. Most of the good books on the Iranian Revolution are written by sociologists because they study social protest movements. And the Iranian Revolution, perhaps in contradistinction to others, has escaped the grasp of historians. I have taken my shot at it, and I'm doing the next book on it. So maybe I'll try to get it right the second time. I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. role, because it's a contentious issue, the role of the United States in Iran from 1941 to 1980. And I want to say a couple of things about it, because it is my opinion that America certainly made mistakes in Iran, but the intentions were benign, and the impact of the American policy in Iran was largely positive. It's a constructive legacy, and I think one that we can maybe not acclaim, but certainly not censure the way it has been. If it wasn't for the United States in 1946, a large chunk of the Iranian territory would be in the Soviet Union. So the territorial integrity of Iran was the initiative of Harry Truman and his Iranian interlocutors, but the Iranians would not have succeeded without Harry Truman's muscle. So a big chunk of the country would now be in something called the Russian Federation if it was not for the United States. In my opinion, in 1953, the United States assisted those nationalists who were opposed to Prime Minister Mossadegh's ruinous policies as they saw them. So it wasn't that Iran overthrew a democratically elected government. It was it's the United States cooperated with some Iranian nationalists who were against another Iranian nationalist, Dr. Mossadegh. Every American president, with the exception of Richard Nixon, advised the Shah to reform his politics, broaden his governing coalition, and focus on economics as opposed to foreign policy adventures. The Shah rejected the advice. Every American Secretary of Defense opposed the military buildup that the Shah undertook in the late 1960s and the 1970s, which added enormous burdens to his economy. Robert McNamara opposed it. Mel Leffler probably did too, but I forget the name, James Schlesinger opposed it. Don Rumsfeld opposed it. Mel Laird. Every American Secretary of Defense opposed the buildup and advised the Shah against it. When things go wrong in Iran, Americans tend to blame themselves. And when the revolution happened, of course, somebody had to take the blame. In 1948-49, the question was who lost China. Everybody kind of settled, or Republican critics of President Truman settled on him. And certainly the Truman administration made a fair share of mistakes in China, but that's a different issue. It is often suggested, and I end on these 2 points, that Jimmy Carter lost Iran. As I said, when things go wrong in Iran, Americans blame themselves. So the Republicans blame Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter blamed the intelligence agencies. The thing is, they're all wrong. Jimmy Carter did not lose Iran. I have said this before, and I'll say it again, to the chagrin of many of my Reaganite friends. No American tried harder to thwart the Iranian Revolution than Jimmy Carter. No American committed the United States to a formal policy of regime change, as far as I know, other than Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter blamed the intelligence community, and I think he's wrong about that. The intelligence community got 3 things right. They noticed the signs of discontent in Iran in the 1970s. It was hard to miss. They noticed the rise of religion as central to political dissent. And during the course of the revolution, they noticed that the Shah was unable to control the situation and contain it. The one thing that the American intelligence services got wrong from the first to the last day of the revolution was the idea that the Iranian army was a cohesive enough force to step in and control the situation, even if the Shah falters. And I think that was a mistake. Now, that's another issue that about 4 people argue about all the time, whether if the General Officer Corps had ordered the crackdown, the conscripts would have carried it out. Some say the conscripts would not have, some say this. It is my opinion, and it's just my opinion, that had the generals ordered the crackdown, the conscripts would have discharged their obligations, but it's something that people will argue about. But the critical mistake that the intelligence community made was to believe in the resilience of the Iranian military. And from that, you can see an entire spectrum of other mistakes. Namely that even if the Shah is incapable of acting, there are others in his place who can do so. They were wrong about that. But The Iranian Revolution was a distinctly Iranian affair, and it came about because of the agency of the Iranian people, and I'm a big, as Ken knows, a big person in blaming the regional actors for the mistakes in their countries. I blame Israelis, Palestinians for the impasse in the Palestinian peace process. I blame Iranians for what is happening in Iran. I blame Iraqis for what happens in Iraq. So I assign agency. And as I get older, I have very limited tolerance for whining. Get off my lawn. The legacy of the revolution for today, there are two legacies. Again, the Iranian legacy and the legacy on the American thinking about Iran. In Iran, the legacy is an unusual one because the regime faces the same impasse and the same set of factors and the same inability to resolve the problems. That doesn't mean it will end up in the same way that the Pahlavi Dynasty did. History does not always repeat itself. In my opinion, it doesn't always rhyme. The impact of the legacy of the Iranian Revolution on the American thinking about Iran, there is none. You can hear the same thing said about the Islamic Republic today that people said about the Shah's regime in 1978. It's been around for 40 years. It has confronted a lot of problems. It has managed through, and therefore it will manage through again. That the endurance of the Islamic Republic is a given, self-evident verity, as opposed to an assumption that people can think about. But there are competing legacies in both countries. The Iranian revolutionaries are uniquely incapable of learning from their own revolution today, simply because they have mythologized it so much. They cannot approach it as a historical event, which is one reason why they may be making the same historical mistakes. Anyway, I'll stop right there and I'll entertain any comments, questions, or concerns that my fellow panelists have. They all have their own perspective on these issues, which in many ways is far more informed than mine, so I yield to them for the remainder of this.
Thanks, Ray. That was great. I'll just say one quick word before moving to our panelists. I'll say to the audience, one of the things I particularly liked about this book was that it's grounded in a deep primary archival research. And it tells people things that they don't necessarily want to hear, regardless of their political point of view. There's something in here for everybody to dislike, and I mean that as a compliment. In other words, it's intellectually honest. So what Ray does through a deep research into the American archives, as well as on the Iranian side, is to show that Iranian actors really were the lead actors inside Iran, not the United States, which can be inconvenient. That is not necessarily the conventional wisdom in the academy, for example, or in wide circles inside the US or overseas. Furthermore, his revisionist take on Carter, I found particularly interesting. That's also something that some people probably aren't going to want to hear. In any case, it's a stimulating read, and it's a deeply researched and honest one. And so for that very reason, we're now going to turn to respondents. We'll start with Ambassador Edelman.
Thank you, Colin. First of all, it's really a pleasure to be on this panel. Normally, that's this is a grace note, but I really worked with Ray, and so I admire a lot of what he's done. But Ken, I've learned enormous amounts from over the years, from his writing as well, and our moderator Colin Dueck also. I even assign some of my students at SAIS some of what Colin has written. So really is great to be with you. I think Ray's being a little too modest in talking about this book. I think the book is actually, as Colin just said, quite revisionist in the best sort of way, precisely because, as Colin says, it is rooted in primary sources that have, in some cases, only recently become available and were not available to earlier students of Iran and Reza Shah's Pahlavi's rule. I would focus actually on 3 points, and they're points that both Ray and Colin have touched on. It's impossible to write about this period or think about this period without looking at the Shah's restoration in 1953. And although I haven't seen the Snyder cut of the Justice League movie, I know enough about comic books to know that every supervillain has an origin story. And the origin story of US-Iranian relations is the original sin of US intervention on behalf of the Shah against Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. And any number of scholars have written about this. I mean, I feel this very keenly because I was sworn in as a Foreign Service officer on January 2nd, 1980, the first class of FSOs taken after the students following the Imam's line had seized the embassy in 1979. And of course, with 40 plus of our colleagues being held hostage, this was the only thing anybody was talking about. And I remember at the time reading Kermit Roosevelt's book, which had just been published a few months earlier, Counter Coup, which is an account of Roosevelt's personal involvement as a CIA operations officer in Iran, with the coup. And his book, along with Donald Wilbur's official CIA history of the coup, which became available before many of the documents surrounding the entire event were actually published by the State Department in the Foreign Relations series. Many writers and scholars who wrote about this were operating from, I would say, kind of distortion from the sources that highlighted the CIA's role in a way that was disproportionate to its actual contribution to the events of 1953, and that is true of certainly of Stephen Kinzer's very influential book, All the Shah's Men, but others as well, Mark Gasiorowski, Stephen Marsh, Frank Gavin. Some have dealt with it better and worse. I think Marsh and Gavin better, Kinzer worse, but really Ray is the first author, I think. I mean, there are others. Dariush Bayandar has also written in the same vein as Ray, but Ray, I think, is the first one to really pull together the new sources in a kind of comprehensive story here that, as he says, returns the agency to the Iranians, who actually were the drivers of events, not the U.S. Whatever one thinks of the U.S. involvement, its contribution was on the margin, not at the center of what happened in Iran. And in particular, and Ray kind of mentioned this, but I think it's worth highlighting in terms of the impact it has on today's U.S.-Iranian relationship. One of the mainstays of support for the Shah was the Iranian clergy. And that is an inconvenient fact that many of them would like to put down the memory hole today while they curse the great Satan and scream, for death to America. The other really revisionist point is one that Colin just mentioned and struck me as well, and that is the very interesting analysis of the revolution in 1979 that Ray has in the book, and to show how good I think it is, and this is a high compliment. I've replaced in my own course on diplomatic disasters at SAIS, Mark Bowden's Guest of the Ayatollah for Ray's chapter on the revolution, because I think, again, it pulls together so much of the material that is recently opened and become available to scholars that allows a much more rounded portrait of the revolution and the role particularly that President Carter played. Now, I will have to confess, I am not yet 100% persuaded about this revisionist case about Carter. The problem is Carter's administration was kind of a house divided against itself between his very tough, hardline national security advisor, the late Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose office at SICE is catty corner from mine, and his Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance. And Carter, I think, oscillated honestly between the two. I'm not sure he was quite as tough-minded about Iran as Ray makes him out to be, but I'm going to be looking forward with great anticipation to Ray's next book, where I think he's going to try and make the case in greater detail, and perhaps he'll be able to persuade me then. Let me make one final observation about this book, which is that Ray and I together wrote a very little book about the U.S.-Iranian relationship, and particularly after the revolution a couple of years ago, before he published The Last Shah. And one of the points we made in there was that Iran has, since the Second World War, certainly during the Cold War, became both a kind of mirror and a template for broader U.S. Policy in the Third World. As Ray mentioned in his remarks, it was the first instance of Truman's get tough policy with the Soviets in 1946. It becomes the first case of President Eisenhower's reliance on covert action throughout the 50s, which he did elsewhere in the Third World, in Guatemala, in Indonesia, and other places. The white revolution that the Shah launched was became, although it was not regarded as sufficient, was to some degree the exemplar of the role that modernization theory played in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations in the Third World. And of course, despite the views of Secretary Laird, for whom I have enormous respect, I think one of the greatest secretaries of defense in a job that my SICE colleague Charlie Stevenson has called the impossible job. The Nixon administration's Nixon doctrine, which called for regional countries to become essentially deputy sheriffs to police their own regions, the Shah's Iran became the poster child in that sense for the Nixon doctrine. So in every case, the Iranians became a kind of petri dish in which U.S. third world policy was worked out. I mean, in the Carter administration, it was the call for greater observance of human rights. So it's wonderful to read Ray's book, because he really does show, while he doesn't highlight it, he shows in detail how this worked itself out in the U.S.-Iranian relationship. And so I encourage all of our viewers who have not yet availed themselves of the opportunity to learn from this book to do so, because as Iran returns inevitably to the center of people's focus in the Biden administration with the question of what to do about the JCPOA, this book will tell them more than 99% of the op-eds, including several I've written about this subject.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. Next, let's hear from Ken.
Thank you so much, Colin. And I will also thank all of you and say what a great treat, what a privilege it is for me to be sharing a screen with you guys. Colin, and I've always considered you one of the most thoughtful of our foreign policy experts. I love reading everything you write. Eric, you may not remember this, but we literally met in the White House when I was at the NSC. I think you were coming over to see Mark Paris. And for those of you who don't know Eric, you should, because he is easily one of the finest public servants that our nation has had over the course of the last generation. And both in terms of his thinking and his ability to act. When you're in government, seeing someone who can act in a smart and effective way and get things done, right? You just want to clone an Eric Edelman. We only could have you as ambassador to Finland and Turkey, and my God, we needed you in 100 other countries easily. And Ray, as he's pointed out, he and I spent a lot of time together, and Ray, I will pay you the highest compliment, which is I have never had an uninteresting conversation with you. And I think that you've written a terrific book. So let me just quickly add a few things about things I've liked, and just kind of repeat some things that both Colin and Eric have said, you also mentioned. And then I wanted to also bring out a couple of things that stood out to me from reading the book that I hadn't been thinking before, that maybe you might want to comment on, that you might want to think about a little bit. And obviously, Eric and Colin, you guys are welcome to as well. They're just things that stood out to me. So first, again, I want to reiterate this point that Colin and Eric have made, that Ray have as well, that one of the really terrific things about this book, I think one of the things that is revolutionary about this book, is that Ray has made the Iranians the heroes of their own story. Right? And that's really the way that I would put it. We talked about giving them agency, but I really think that's how you have to see it. They are once again the heroes of their own story. And as we've all commented on, that is, it's kind of striking how rare that is, how the kind of, the discourse on Iran is endlessly how they are the object of the sentence rather than the subject of the sentence. And Ray's done a remarkable job of restoring their role in their own story. And it's not necessarily straightforward. There are lots of divisions and debates. I want to come back to that in just a minute, right? But they are very much the heroes. And it's not to say that other countries and other actors don't play a role as well. They obviously do. But you see what is going on with the Iranians and how in many cases they are the ones who are controlling their own destiny. And following on from that, one of the other things I think is great about this book, and as I was reading it through and kind of rethinking this history, right, one of the things that leapt out from the pages to me was the constant frustration of the United States with Iran and its governments, right? Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon, Carter, every single one of them is constantly furious at the Iranians, trying to get the Iranians to do things. Right? It gives you a very different, and I would say an infinitely more realistic understanding of that relationship. Again, the common wisdom is very much, the Shah was our puppet, right? And, Washington said jump and the Shah said how high. Right. And he said how high, when he hit the ceiling, he's like, do you want me to go higher? Right? And nothing could be further from the truth. And again, Ray's deep work into the documentary evidence, I think, has really pulled out what the reality of that relationship was and how difficult it was for the United States to deal with Iran and also with the Shah. Right, who emerges from Ray's pages as a much more complex character. Right? He is a much more fully rounded character. It's the difference between the two-dimensional characters of, Eric said, a comic book or a sitcom, however you want to think of it, to a much more three-dimensional, fully fleshed out character that you might see in a great drama, whether it's a terrific movie starring, De Niro or somebody like that, or whether it's, great book by a terrific author who really can make that person a human being, right? This is not merely a puppet. This is someone who is very complex. And Ray brings out the complexity of the Shah's character and then how that complexity shapes both his approach to Iranian domestic politics and Iranian foreign policy, and therefore how it affects the US-Iran relationship, which is huge, and we've just never really seen it. I'll also say, and again, Eric and Colin both made this point, the work that Ray did in terms of diving into the documentary evidence, and in particular the new material, is just terrific. Some of you are probably aware, I wrote a book on Iran and the US 15, 16, 17 years ago, right? And there was stuff in there that I kind of suspected and was able to hint at. Ray has really been able to bring that stuff to life, right? So one in particular that Ray and I have talked about and that really is meaningful to me was when I wrote my book, I just felt like Khomeini must have known about the embassy takeover. And there was one tantalizing piece of evidence. And I was able to cite that and say, look, this isn't definitive, but there's this one tantalizing piece of evidence that really does strongly suggest. And Ray was able to add 4 or 5 additional very important points to that. And as he himself says, look, we don't have a smoking gun. We don't have an order written by Khomeini saying, take over the embassy. But, what he was able to do, I think really has nailed that down in a way we weren't before. Okay, so two things that kind of stood out to me from the book as I was reading it, two patterns. And as I said, I'd love to get Ray's thoughts on this because they're just, as I was reading along, the things that stood out to me, and welcome Eric and Colin to comment as well. So one thing, Ray, was that, it's clearly there with Mossadegh, but I think that it's true for a number of other Iranian leaders that there is a tendency toward extremism by Iranian populist leaders that I think you see over and over again. At some level, that may sound a little bit trite, but I think that it's particularly the case with the Iranians, right? Mossadegh differentiates himself from his rivals in part by taking the most extreme position on oil nationalization, right? And then he's kind of got a tiger by the tail, right? And he almost can't give in to any of the offers, right? It's unclear exactly what was going on, but it really feels, and again, something I really felt in reading your book, that he felt like he couldn't give in to anything less than the absolute maximum, even though he probably understood that it was A, never going to happen, B, was probably going to be disastrous for Iran if he had actually done it, and C, could have led to some really bad consequences. And then that really struck me when I was reading your last chapter on the revolution, because to a certain extent, Khomeini does the same thing. Right. And Khomeini, too, is, he's a larger than life figure like Mossadegh. He has other sources of power, but he nevertheless has a competition. And he, too, continuously stakes out the absolute hardest line position. And that got me thinking. And I also was thinking that, somebody like on the other side, Mohammad Khatami, the Iranian president from 97 to 2005, right? He, to some extent, does the same thing on the other side, but he doesn't prove as courageous as these other guys. And then you have Ahmadinejad, and right, Ahmadinejad is a lunatic, we all know that, but he too stakes out the hardest position and keeps trying to run with it. And so I just wonder, it raised in my mind, I'd love to get your thoughts on whether you think that there is this pattern out there, especially with Iranian populist leaders trying to differentiate themselves by taking the absolute most extreme position that they could, and then that trapping them. And then the other pattern that occurred to me as I was reading through Last Shah was, and you do a nice job of this, the fragmentation of the Iranian system. Right. And in particular, I think that this shines through really well in those early chapters on the 40s and the 50s, but then again comes back up in the last chapter on the revolution, right? And it's even there a little bit under the Shah in his early days, but as you nicely point out, the Shah is trying to gain control over this very fragmented political system, right? And he eventually does through his autocracy, and you nicely demonstrate the problems with that. But it raises in my mind this question of, and in fact, Khomeini then of course restores that autocracy to at least as great a degree as the Shah did. There's some fragmentation when Khamenei succeeds him, but Khamenei too has more or less restored that. And it raises in my mind this question of, if you do not have this, uber powerful, this all powerful autocrat, do you get this kind of fragmentation, which is obviously deeply problematic for the Iranian system, no matter whether it's run by good people or bad, right? It's going to create all kinds of inertia and potentially chaos. Right? And that, to my mind, is also worth thinking about because it says something about the future of Iran. Right? We are all contemplating the death of Ayatollah Khamenei and what's going to come after him. And one of the possibilities, something that I've floated on a number of occasions, is the possibility of a collective leadership. That they won't actually find another Khamenei, or they'll find a figurehead, but that you'll have a more collective leadership, probably made up of hardliners. But if that fragmentation that I feel like I saw in your book is an accurate one, and that if the only way to overcome it, at least that the Iranians have figured out, is with some incredibly powerful autocrat, and that person doesn't exist after Khamenei, right? Could you get that fragmentation leading to greater entropy in the Iranian political system? That I'll throw it over to you.
Thanks very much. Those are all insightful comments. Mohammad Mossadegh and Khomeini were similar, as you mentioned, in their maximalist approach, but there were maximalist approach to different issues. Mossadegh just could not resolve the oil issue. He waited for the best possible deal. When he got the best possible deal, he rejected it. He rejected all deals. To be fair to Mossadegh, the British rejected all the same offers anyways, as well. So the Americans kept coming up with new ingenious offers, but both parties seemed to want the resolution of this particular conflict. I would say the one difference between Mossadegh and Khomeini, and what makes Khomeini stand out in the contemporary history of Iran, is Khomeini's sheer inhumanity and cruelty. He was completely indifferent to human life. When his son died, he didn't go to the funeral. When they told him your son died, he said, "Those who come from God return to God." Khomeini was a number of things. He was a revolutionary, but a revolutionary's integrity, in a sense that he never forfeited those values and was indifferent to the sacrifices that his policies entailed. He was a clergyman who claimed to know the mind of God, and that always leads to some degree of certainty. And he was a politician who could be mendacious and supple, but never lose track of his ultimate objectives. Mossadegh had some of those traits, but I don't think he had the cruelty that Khomeini displayed in his life. The fragmentations and fissures in Iranian political society are almost inevitable, because if you look at the 20th century Iranian history and well into 21st century, it is a struggle between a population that seeks some measure of representation and central governments that do not want it to have those. And eventually, in one case, the population succeeds, the 1979 revolution. But that struggle goes on, and that struggle itself defines the fissures and fragmentations within the political society, within the governing elite, because there are some who are more responsive to that representation desire than others. Today, I think I agree that the Iranian political system is largely closed, and Khomeini is, to me, Khomeini has always resembled the Shah more than his predecessor. And Lampton said about the Shah, he's a dictator who cannot dictate. He cannot rule Iran, but won't let anybody else do it. There's always been concerns in Iranian political circles that Khomeini has a little too much of the Shah in him. In a moment of crisis, he may be unreliable. We haven't seen him confront that kind of a crisis to the degree that the Shah did, so his conduct remains indeterminate. In a post-succession, I don't know, I mean, even after Khomeini, there was the idea of collective leadership. I think you'll have a collective leadership, but not so much in terms of the supreme leader being divided into 3, 4 parts, but in terms of different institutions having greater power. Even that was the case in Khomeini's early tenure from 1989 to about, I think Khomeini really met his moment with the rise of the reform movement, where he successfully crushed the Khatami reform movement. His greatest triumph became Iran's greatest tragedy. So it takes him some time to consolidate his power and displace his rivals and undermine his adversaries. And I think the next supreme leader will have similar degree of hesitancy and similar lack of ability to control the political system and the compulsion to share authority with other institutions, whether it's the military, whether it's the tradition, whether it's the strong clergy, or maybe even an sort of parliament. There'll be a period where there'll be some divisions within the Iranian political society, political leadership, as the inevitable process of consolidation takes place, or the regime can collapse altogether. The consolidation process may not necessarily be inevitable. It is hard to see how the system, but the system that will go through succession, whenever it is that Khomeini dies, will be a little different than the 1989 succession crisis, because at that time, the revolution was not as exhausted. It still had some resonance. It wasn't contaminated by corruption and abuses that have taken place in the intervening 3 decades. And the bonds between state and society had not been attenuated to the degree that they have been today. So the succession will take place in a different domestic political context, and it'll take place in a different international and regional context. I would say one of the advantages that the prospective successor will have is the Islamic Republic is a more mature institution, is a more mature political body, and so therefore it has put in some roots. So whoever Khamenei's successor is, Raisi or whoever it is, he will have greater familiarity with actors within the scene, because the political elite, as narrowly defined today, at least are familiar to each other. They have worked with each other for 3 decades in overcoming various crises and undertaking various crusades. It is entirely possible that the regime may not be able to sustain itself. That's always a difficult thing to predict, but I think it will face some serious headwinds moving forward, whatever the succession crisis may be. But I would say that if the regime does survive a succession crisis, it will undergo a period of internal instability within the government, as different actors try to jockey for more power and determine the course of action that the country will take in terms of economic planning, political planning, and its foreign relations as well. So that's what I'm saying.
Thanks, Ray. So I have a couple questions for all of you, depending on how much time we have. But the very first thing I'd like to do is actually just for Ray, Eric gave you a little polite pushback on Carter's oscillations. Can we just and one of the most interesting things in your book is the revisionism on Carter. Can you just say a word, Ray, about that? Expand on the point about Carter a little bit?
Yeah, I think there is a Carter revisionist school that's emerging, and thus far, I think it has 4 members. And Carter's not one of them. It's me, in some ways, Stu Eisenstadt, in different ways, Kai Bird, and different ways, Jonathan Alter, the 2 recent biographers of Jimmy Carter. Kai Bird's book coming out in May. I would say what I did say about Carter, he was a person who was unusually self-confident. It is suggested in his Baptist faith, the most important sin is pride. To be fair, he didn't do much to be prideful about. But a person of unusual degree of self-confidence. When he decided to run for president, he told his mother, "I'm going to run for president." She said, "Of what?" I think the divisions that Eric speaks about are true. Cy Vance and Zbigniew Brzezinski disagreed with each other about what to do with Iran. And in some way, they were both wrong. Zbigniew Brzezinski thought an iron fist strategy would work, and Cy Vance thought that the coalition government would work. They were both right about each other's position. I think Carter does, and more documentary record comes out, we'll need to see more of this, does impose discipline on his administration, maybe a little late in the day when he focuses on it, which is in November. That seems late to us because we know what happened in February, but it didn't seem that late. And he does advise the Shah in November to crack down. He does send General Heiser to plan a coup. He does actually, there is a call made to Heiser whether he would do a coup. That is a call made by Zbigniew Brzezinski, chairman of Joint Chiefs David Jones and Charles Duncan. That could not have come about without Carter's consent. And after the revolution, in December 1979, he signed a presidential finding authorizing regime change policy in Iran, which was a misjudgment because the revolution was too vibrant. So in that sense, he does seem more resolute than his critics give. This harmony in his administration is correct, and he does try to impose some order on it. I suspect he was not as successful in imposing that order than any other administration. Other administrations have similar divisions. The only administration that I think in recent memory where everybody was on the same page was in some ways the Obama administration. And that's sort of a mind melt does not always serve well. So Carter was a person of determination. He was self-confidence, too arrogant to be pushed around by anybody. ill-tempered, downright mean-spirited. The post-presidency image of Jimmy Carter as a man of peace, I think, goes against his record. You can, in some of the archives of the book we've been talking about, Eric, the Soviets in 1980 did not want Jimmy Carter to be reelected. They actually preferred Ronald Reagan to be elected because they thought that's a return to Nixon and détente.
They had a preference for Republicans.
Because you can say the antecedent of Reagan's policy in Afghanistan were Carter. The antecedent of Reagan's buildup was Carter, the MX missile and so on. And in Iran, as I said, he tried to do what he can. I think I take Eric's point that he was not always successful in imposing order on his administration. But I would say to Eric, and I would yield to his judgment, which is much to his experience, most administrations have that difficulty, Eric, don't they?
So let me drill into this a little bit, since Colin has opened up this vein, which I think we can exploit a little bit. So I would love, because you talk about this in the book, one of the most interesting parts or most interesting episodes of the U.S. policy on the revolution is Ambassador Sullivan's telegram to Washington when he writes about thinking the unthinkable, and Carter's response to the instructions Sullivan gets, which he refuses to carry out in a kind of amazing act of insubordination, which Carter is furious about. So could you comment a little bit about the Sullivan Carter relationship? Because it strikes me as an interesting part of this story. And because one thing I couldn't quite tell from your account was who you thought had the better understanding of what was actually going on in Iran. Was it Sullivan or was it Carter?
I would say Ambassador Bill Sullivan was a professional diplomat in the best sense of the word. I do think, Eric, he did discharge his obligations and instructions even when he disagreed with them. In the critical meeting where Carter tells Sullivan to go tell Shah to restore order, Sullivan is skeptical whether that could happen. But he does discharge that obligation. He tells the Shah that's what the Carter wants. It's the Shah who rejects the advice. And Bill Sullivan, I think, as I said, when things go wrong in Iran, Americans blame each other. Carter blames CIA and Bill Sullivan. Bill Sullivan was a professional diplomat in the best sense of the word. Here's what I would say about him. He was a Foreign Service officer who understood those whom he dealt with, which was the Shah and his generals. And he correctly arrived at the judgment that these people are worthless. He was not very good at assessing those whom he did not encounter, the exiles in Paris, Khomeini and all that. So his misapprehensions was to believe that there are the pragmatic people that he encountered in Iran were the revolution's actual helmsmen. But his assessment of the Pahlavi Dynasty was actually spot on, that these people are just not worthless. But every time his instructions were given to him, as far as I can tell, he discharged those obligations. And he was unnecessarily blamed by Carter and Brzezinski for insubordination, as far as I can tell. Sullivan wrote a very angry memoir that probably didn't help him. He should have taken a little time and thought it through. But I think I would say about Bill Sullivan, what I would say about Jimmy Carter, what I would say about Zbig Brzezinski, Cy Vance, the embassy officials, the American intelligence services, they all did the best they could under extraordinary circumstances. And they all tried to collaborate with each other to prevent the collapse of the Pahlavi Dynasty, even though the Pahlavi Dynasty desperately wanted to collapse. So one of my revisionist accounts is of Bill Sullivan. Having read a fair share of cables from him, I think he began to understand. Now, Thinking the Unthinkable is one of the most famous cables other than George Kennan's. But if you read the cable, it's actually just an exercise in intellectual speculation. And the final paragraph is, I think we should think about these contingencies, But at the end of the day, I think our current policy is correct. So Bill Sullivan had the misfortune of being in Iran when everything collapsed. And as I said, Zbigniew Brzezinski, probably more so than Jimmy Carter, did much to shift the blame toward him. And it wasn't fair to him. I don't think. I had these conversations with his nephew, John Sullivan, that Bill Sullivan did not, as with all Americans in 1978, 79, did the best he could under extraordinary circumstances, dealing with Iranian actors that were frequently unreliable, quite often mendacious, and usually not prone to discharge their own obligations. And that's what I would say about that relationship. It was a relationship that disintegrated into antagonism because, in my opinion, Carter wanted somebody to blame. And Stansfield Turner led the charge by blaming his own agency. And so to his credit, Cy Vance did what he could to protect Bill Sullivan from charge. But your larger point that there were discordant voices in the State Department is correct. The State Department and the NSC was not on the same page. And whether or not Carter was as successful as managing the fissures within his government as he should have been, I yield to your experience. I think George W. Bush had a problem managing the divisions within his administration. I think Bill Clinton had those problems. Every administration has those problems. And there's the other issue that people talk about. Just because Carter makes a decision, and this is a point that David Aaron, the Carter's Deputy National Security Advisor, made to me, is just because we said something out of the White House, that doesn't necessarily mean somebody in State Department would carry it out. Because somebody in consulate will look at the instructions and say, yeah, I'm not doing that today.
Thanks, Ray. So I have one question for all three of you. And if we go a couple minutes over, that's fine with me. If we're cut off, we can just get together for a drink and keep this going. My one question is, and we'll start with Ray, then Eric, then Ken. Obviously the Biden administration is looking in the abstract to reach out to Tehran diplomatically, return to something like the Obama era nuclear arms control agreement. So what implications, if any, do you see from this book, the research revealed in this book, for current U.S. policy toward Iran, current U.S.-Iran relations? We'll start with Ray.
Well, I would say the assumption about the durability of the Islamic, the certainty about the durability of the Islamic Republic should be turned, it's an assumption that should be turned into a question. And people should really think about whether this regime can persist, given all its problems, which are eerily similar to the Shah's regime in the mid-1970s and the Soviets in the mid-1980s. So I would actually start out by thinking that they should turn all their assumptions into questions. And this is something that maybe wasn't done as much in the mid-1970s about the sheer durability and resilience of the regime, given the headwinds that it confronts. And depending on which side of that argument you come down, that informs your choices moving forward about arms control, détente, or others. The Biden administration thus far, people talk about this Iran policy. As far as I know, it does not have one. It is currently still implementing a maximum strategy of pressure that for the past 4 years, they denounced as a failure. It is trying to return to an agreement that it now recognizes as defective. So they're upholding a strategy which they pronounce as a failure, and they want to return to an agreement which they think is also a failure. So they have a lot of intellectual contradictions to work out, but it's still early for them to do so. But I would actually focus on many of the things that happened in the mid-1970s about whether this regime can actually persist as it has, and what does that mean if it doesn't.
I think the big lesson that I take away from Ray's book, and this goes back to something Ken said earlier about the dissatisfaction that repeated administrations had with the Shah and with his minions. We Americans, and it's not just true about Iran, it's true of other places as well, think that we can understand the dynamics in other societies and make them work for us. And of course, that's the job of diplomats, is to try and do that. But I think in the case of Iran, Ray documents pretty well how faulty our judgments were all along the line. I mean, there was, the one possible exception is, ironically, is 1953, when people do realize that there are these divisions among Iranians that might be able to be parlayed into removing a thorn in both Britain and the United States side, which was Mohammad Mossadegh. But for the most part, and certainly since the revolution, I think our ability to read the factional politics in Iran and play it to our advantage has been mostly a record of unremitting failure. And so to the voices who, are saying to those of our friends who serve in the Biden administration, do something now before June 18th, because, after the election, you won't be dealing with, the moderates like Rouhani. You're going to be dealing with, God knows what, and it could be worse. And, I think that is kind of a siren song to avoid. Just kind of stick to the knitting, which is, try and see if there's a way that you can continue the pressure until you can actually get an agreement to negotiate something that actually shuts the door on all the pathways to a nuclear weapon by Iran, which may be possible, may not be.
I'll pick up on Eric's point and extrapolate a point that I made earlier. Ray, I think, is nicely documented, which is that we also need to recognize that Iran has its own politics, and that Iran's own politics are the primary driver in its behavior. Right? And as Ray's book really nicely documents, Americans have a tendency to assume that we have a greater role and therefore greater influence with Iran than we actually do. Right? And I think that we saw this under the Trump administration as well, who believed that if we impose these very harmful, very hurtful sanctions on Iran, that the Iranians would have to buckle and give us whatever deal that we wanted to get. And of course they didn't, right? Because what that assumed was that the Iranians were desperate, that they would approach their economy the way that we did, that they would give in. And I think that we are fooling ourselves to simply think that the Iranians are going to do what we want them to do unless we put tremendous pressure on them. Right. Here we all have a mutual colleague, Karim Sajidpour, who has a wonderful line, which is that the Iranians don't bend to pressure, but they do bend to a lot of pressure. Right. And the ultimate point that I think that Ray's book illustrates is that that's because Iran's internal politics are so important to it that it requires an enormous amount of external influence, pressure, whatever you want to put it, to really overcome the powerful drivers of Iran's domestic politics. Terrific.
Thanks, Ken. Okay, well, this has been a really useful discussion, and it's, as I said, it's a terrific book. I love Ray's summary of no whining, get off my lawn. It's just useful on multiple fronts. So thanks to everybody on this panel. It's exciting to know that Ray's next book will be focusing specifically on the revolution. So with that, thanks to our audience, thanks to our panelists. Thank you, Ray. Congratulations. And
I just wanted to thank AEI for hosting this event, and to Colin and Ken and Eric for participating in it. Thank you very much.
Well done, Ray. Congratulations.
Thank you all.
What a pleasure.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye from AEI.